modules. So I'll hit enter there and do a listing, and now you can see the kernel version number. This is just a directory of modules. If you had ever installed multiple different kernel versions on this computer, then there would be multiple directories here for the older kernel versions and so on. You just want to go into the one that you're running right now. And for me, that choice is easy because there's only one in here. So I go in there and I do a listing, and now you can see the modules.dep file for the modules dependencies that we were talking about earlier that I didn't tell you where that was before. It's in this lib/modules/kernel version number. There's modules.dep. And then there's this directory in there called kernel. All right. If we go into kernel, you'll see in there that there's more directories, and these are just classifications of different modules for the kernel. The net ones are for networking modules. FS are for file system-oriented modules. All right. So they're just classified in these different organizations, and when you go to insert a module with insmod or modprobe, this is where they're coming from. To make a device accessible to the users of your system, it's actually pretty easy. The first thing that you have to know about is the /dev directory. Now, the /dev directory holds one entry for every device on your system. And it actually holds one entry for every device you might ever add to your system. That might seem like a tall claim, but when we go back out to the Linux screen, we'll do an ls on the /dev directory, and you'll see hundreds and hundreds, if not 1,000 and some files in that directory. And then what it is there's files in this directory, and the files all refer to some device or some partition on some device or something like that. And the way that you control access to that device is you just change permissions on this file. So this file is like a file like any other file we've seen. That's got read and write permissions. It's got an owner, it's got a group, and so on. And if I change permissions on this file, that's going to change permissions on the device that it's referring to. Now, I've listed some here like FDX, like FD0, FD1, FD2, and that's for the floppy disks on your system. The devices in there that start with HD refer to IDE hard disks. So HDA refers to the first one, HDB refers to the second one, HDA1 refers to the first partition on the first disk, and so on. Okay, and we've seen that before. I just wanted to refresh your memory. And then the devices that start with SD are for SCSI disks. The X and the Y mean the same thing as on the IDE disks. And then there's a whole subdirectory of the /dev directory for USB devices. So /dev/USB/whatever, all the devices in there are USB devices. Okay? And like I said, you just change the permissions on this file, and that's going to change the permissions on the device. What I want to do now is go back out to the Linux screen, and let's poke around the /dev directory a little bit more. So let's go over to the /dev directory. Okay, and we'll do an ls, and I'll just hit enter here and let it run up the screen just so you can see how many files are coming up. I mean, it's like 7 columns wide, and it was many pages long. So there's just tons and tons of files in here. I want to do a long listing on one of these files, FD0. Let's do the listing on the floppy disk. Floppy drive. So this floppy drive, you can see here, is owned by Perry. And that's just because this is the way Red Hat deals with it. That's because I logged in as Perry to this computer, and so now, even though I'm the root user, I've switched over to be the root user, because I logged in as Perry, it gave Perry access or ownership of the FD0 floppy drive. All right? And the reason it did that is because certain operations that you do on a floppy drive, like if you're going to format a disk on a floppy drive, you need ownership of the drive to do that. And that's why Red Hat gives you that permission. Now, other distributions of Linux don't do that, and they leave it up to the system administrator to deal with this. Now, the system administrator could deal with it any number of ways. The system administrator could just give the person ownership of the device, and then they'll be able to format disks on the floppy drive. Or there's this group here called floppy. The system administrator could put people into the floppy group that need to do like format floppy disks, things like that. Okay, so just like when we used groups to share files in directories in our home directory and stuff, we can use groups so that multiple people, certain people that we determine can access this device directly, like to format a disk or something. Now, a lot of devices like SCSI disks and things like that, we don't ever need to give like ownership of that device. And actually, it would probably be a mistake to give a person ownership of the SCSI device, because then they could access it directly and do things, and if they did something incorrectly, maybe the system won't boot anymore. All right? So things like SCSI disks, you know, we should just use the mechanisms and the drivers that are in place to do the access, the reads and writes from that disk, and we don't need direct ownership to do like normal operations on SCSI disks. All right, and and another thing is like Ethernet cards. Ethernet cards are not in, they don't have an entry in the /dev directory. And it's not because they're not supported, it's just because there is never an instance when you need to give direct ownership to somebody for an Ethernet card. Every access to the Ethernet card should be done through the mechanisms and the protocols that we've talked about before, and nobody should ever have direct access to that Ethernet card. All right, so that's like a rundown of the /dev directory, and that pretty much wraps up this video. We'll just do a little wrap up on the whiteboard now. It's time to wrap up our first video on hardware issues. The first thing we talked about was adding hardware to your computer. We talked about physically hooking it up. And just remember that anytime you have to go inside the actual case of the computer and touch something on the motherboard, make sure you're grounded with one of those wrist straps, and make sure you don't touch any power supplies or anything and shock yourself. And then we talked about drivers and modules and kernel modules and how they work, and you know, how you can insert them and remove them from your system. And finally, we just talked about the /dev directory. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for viewing.